G'day mate, it's me, Willie, the Tapwise Owl. Down under, we've got a cheeky little game called 2 Facts and a Fib. Reckon you can spot the porky? Number 1, before hitting record, Andrew swore blind that this was a ripper idea and that my true blue Aussie accent would be a smash hit with all you crafty beer professionals on the YouTubes. Number 2, Tapwise makes it dead easy to run your beer club and bring your mates back to the bar with your very own branded brewery app. Monthly subs are a breeze, perks and rewards tick along on autopilot, and the cash lands in your bank account every night, you business legend. Number 3, in the past year, breweries have pulled in nearly 100,000 extra chatroom visits and raked in over $1 million in recurring revenue with apps of their own. Got the fib? Right, mate. Andrew reckoned this was a bugger idea, but joke's on him. I went and did it anyway. So book a demo today and let's show Andrew you're keen on packed tap rooms, steady revenue, and of course me, Willie, the Tapwise Owl. Cheers, Cobber. Now enough chin wag. Let's get on to the learny bit.
I have to laugh. That was a good ad.
Love that Australian accent too.
No doubt. Well, that was supposed to be the key, right? All right. So welcome, everybody. And thank you for joining us to talk about expansion. I'm Laura Lodge from Startup Brewery. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Andrew and his team at Craft Beer Professionals for hosting the conference, as well as Tapwise and Ollie for sponsoring. Keeping it free is super important for breweries of all sizes right now, especially in today's economy. So thank you for that. Today, we address a situation that's cropping up more and more. A brewery is doing well, expands into either a new taproom location or adds a combination taproom brewing facility, usually makes it at least to opening and then goes out of business completely. I'm sure there's a million different reasons for this, depending on the specific individual circumstances. But the question we're going to look at today is how to vet this kind of opportunity or business strategy to ensure the highest probability of success. We want this opportunity to be your golden ticket every time, rather than weakening your business as a potential Achilles heel. We've structured our time today to begin discussions with your existing facility and work forward into the new location. I'm joined by a terrific panel this afternoon from all walks of the brewing world. The goal is for each to share their unique perspectives so you come away with solid guidance and can approach this situation with confidence. Your panel includes Dustin Hauck of Hauck Architecture, Erik Fowler of the San Diego Brewers Guild, Carrie Shumway of Beer Business Finance, Jeremy Carmy of Central Coast Analytics, and John Carpenter of Openso Consulting. I'll ask each to explain a little bit more about their background as they address the first question. I wanted to do a quick note about Startup Brewery. During the panel today, a couple of your panelists here might refer to an article that they have written that's posted in the Startup Brewery library. If they do that, please know that Startup Brewery is free and you can go to startupbrewery.com, head for that library and find what they've written. So that's not a mysterious behind a paywall thing. That's open and available for you to refer to. So Jeremy, let's start with you. What guidance would you offer around evaluating the current business situation when considering an expansion?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And a lot of what I'll speak to today is related to using data in the brewery, since that's what I specialize in with my business. But what I want to have people think about is as they're signing up to create a more complex business with a bigger team and more things going on, it's really critical to make sure you have a lot of the basics in place first, right? So when I'm thinking about that, it's really with using data to make sure you know what's going on with your current business. A lot of times what this comes into also is instead of maybe just looking at top line metrics where maybe your team currently is focused on just top line sales or top line labor expenses, really dive in a level deeper. Be able to look at like what are some of those underlying drivers when it comes to these metrics you're looking at. So on sales, for example, maybe you're interested in the number of visits or the number of checks, people coming into the building. You're interested in what the average spend is for people that are in there. Also break this down by day of the week and time of the day, right? And it's really the more precise you can get, then the smarter actions you can take, whether that's with your existing business or as you're thinking about opening up this new location when you get into there. Another reason why it's good to track this data is it really sets a good foundation or framework as you're thinking through the new business, right? First of all, here's what our performance is in the current location. And then you have certain assumptions where certain things might be up or down with the new business. So what's really good is then you can build like a bottoms up forecast where you're taking all of these individual metrics you're really getting them aligned to what your new business would be. And it's a great way to pressure test what your financial forecast might have been, which is usually more of a top-down view. So I think that's another really good reason to be able to track some of these metrics as you're making this decision on if you want to open a new location. So just to kind of recap that one, it's before you're purposely becoming a much more complex, potentially chaotic business. If things are really messy now, they're not just going to get better, right? So you need to set this really good framework in place in order to handle and be successful at that more complex business in the future.
So some of that would be available on your POS system, perhaps?
Yep, a lot of it will come out of your point of sale system, especially if you're tracking labor in your point of sale system with people clocking in and clocking out. Otherwise, you could maybe get that information from whatever system that is, and then bring it all together to get those good metrics.
Gotcha. Carrie, you want to piggyback on that?
Sure. I think one of the biggest challenges with expansion is you're taking on more debt. That's one of the biggest reasons why breweries go under is they take on debt. They don't quite adequately forecast the debt service coverage and whatnot. So just getting your systems together is going to mean a lot of different things. But first and foremost, just being aware of the fact that, that additional debt and debt service is one of the biggest challenges that breweries face as they're going through this process. As far as thinking about your financial systems, one of the most basic things that folks can do or think about is within their accounting and general ledger package to be able to report on their different entities separately. Sounds very obvious, but I work with a lot of breweries that just don't do that. And even if you have one location, you might have tap room food, you might have obviously non-food, you might be in distribution, and you really need to start by just simply separating each of those activities so that you can see sales, margins, expenses, and profitability for each of those business units. For those that use QuickBooks, you may be familiar with the term of using classes. So that you might have a taproom food class, a taproom non-food class, a distribution. So the recommendation would be to have a separate location set up within your accounting system so that you can literally you need to be accounting for all this separately. You can also do this in your chart of accounts. So if folks have a full chart of accounts, you can set up different chart of account numbers for the different location. That's fine too. Either of those will work, but just being thoughtful about, when I analyze the numbers, I need to be able to see each business unit. The other thing we talk a lot about systems and SOPs, and we all understand the importance of them, but we rarely actually do them. It sounds really good. But thinking about what are the most important procedures that you can put in place so that you can set yourself up for success, so that you can understand your numbers. So we really recommend thinking about financial standard operating procedures. Like, what are those? And the simplest forms of those would be, you need to have a month-end process to get your books closed. Again, very simple and straightforward, very rarely actually done. We'll work with breweries that it could be, 3-4 weeks after the month, we still don't have the numbers. Why? Well, we don't have a good process. So process really just is a checklist. What do you need to do? Who's going to do it? What are the due dates? Check it off when it's done. Super simple, but super important so that you can get those numbers quickly. Because a lot of times with financial accounting and reporting, it comes so late. It's way too late to do anything about it. So the goal would be, speed that up, speed that information cycle up so that you can, have the numbers to make those data-driven decisions for your business.
So Carrie, when you're setting up this kind of system, am I echoing to anybody but me?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. When you're setting up these kinds of systems, how much of a hall pass do you kind of give the new business for paying for itself after it's open? Do you have kind of a best case or a worst case? Like, when is too long?
Yeah. I think it's, I'm not sure that there's one answer for it. I'd like to see the thing stand on its own pretty quickly. If you're going to start up a new brewery and a new entity, yeah, there's going to be some ramp up, 30, 60, 90 days. That's just a rule of thumb. But so the new business, you'd probably give the same towards kind of leeway to. Having said that, you got to plan for it, right? So if it's going to be consuming, and you see this a lot with, some mergers and acquisitions that go on, is, they'll look at the numbers, and if that new entity isn't performing, the money's got to come from somewhere. It's going to come from the mothership. So you're going to make sure the mothership can support this. And I think along those notes, one of the things that I see folks trip themselves up on a lot is having overly optimistic projections. All that we're going to open the doors and there's going to get flooded with people, or we're going to be able to control our cost. And it's hard to do. So I would say, to answer your question, hall pass or run room, probably shoot for that 30, 60, 90 day window and make sure you can actually cover it with existing working capital.
Sounds good. John, you want to take that further with management?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of these items we've covered are things that need to be considered either before moving in there with potentially outside resources, outside help, consulting help, or with internal core competencies. I mean, and I speak from experience of moving from single location to multi-location and managing complexity in different businesses versus single operations. If you've got a core competency in your management team to manage that kind of complexity, I mean, it's a phenomenal change. If you don't have that core competency within your organization right now, take a beat and go and get some help before you start going there. And then I think really one of the biggest keys in thinking through managing the business and the dollars and cents, the production operations, is where does that kind of org chart grow as your business physically grows into multiple places? And who do you need to fill in each one of these, not necessarily positions, but core competencies that are going to be required as your business becomes more complex? There's no right answer, but the wrong answer is to just plug and play. Well, a big business has this org chart and a small business has this org chart. Every time I've come into kind of businesses to help out, or to organizations, in particular production management organizations, the org chart that works best for them is not the cookie cutter that you can go on a Google search and say, let me ask the AI to tell me what the org chart should look like for a brewery producing 7,000 barrels a year. I mean, AI will tell you anything. It's very, very intelligent, but it's oftentimes very, very wrong. So, my advice, perform that SWOT analysis on your own business. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Where are your opportunities as you grow? And as you grow, what are the threats to your business? And don't just do it from a business standpoint, extend that to your management team and your operations team. I think as we look to grow a business, we should look to grow our human resource equally, or hopefully ahead of time. Because really the humans are who run the business. The business is just walls and equipment and, whatever things that widgets we're creating or selling, no matter whether it's beer or, peanut butter. But the people are really who make it work. And so for me, whether we're talking about, putting together data and metrics, or we're taking into account the financial systems that are required and what that runway does look like, Carrie, that runway looks a lot different if you've got someone internally that can management and can forecast and do a recast and true up every month with your operations, versus one where you're kind of flying blind and you say, hey, let's give this 90 days before we check back in and see if we're bankrupt. So I would spend a lot of time focusing on, is your core management that you have right now able to grow as your business is planned to grow? Or do you need to go outside and hire people with different core competencies? Are those people full-time? Are they part-time? Is it 1099 or pure professional outsourcing? And, how is that going to make you kind of succeed? Within that comes kind of some really, really fun opportunity as well, because as you grow, growth requires further complexity. It also creates opportunity for you to grow your team. One of the things that a lot of smaller facilities don't have anyone dedicated to, which truly will make your life so much easier, is maintenance. As you grow and you become bigger and you have multiple facilities, you have no opportunity to not invest in preventative maintenance. And with preventative maintenance, bringing people in the team who are trained specifically to help you foresee things before they become a problem. as you get bigger, you start focusing more and more on leading variables to help your business succeed before you're there. It's your quality assurance versus your quality control. Those lagging variables of the pump shutting down and you being SOL because you only have one pump. Well, when you're a big facility, you need to make sure that the pumps that you don't have redundancy on, you're checking on daily. But that also means you might have someone internally with that core competency as a maintenance manager with maintenance systems, just like you'll need financial systems that forecast ahead of the time that you're out of money. There's all sorts of different positions in here with the management side that are not only requirements, but just great opportunities to grow the complexity of the team. And even as you move past that, I think there's another financial tie in here with management that people don't tend to think about, and it's inventory management. As you grow, you're going to have a redundancy of inventory if you go to multiple locations, and you need to understand starting up a new product line, starting up a new anything isn't just the rotating cogs. It's not the cost of goods that you're producing. It's creating that infrastructure of sunk cost into the inventory that's required to produce that new line that you'll never get back. You have this platform of costs that's going to have to get invested, that hopefully you have not only production management, but also financial management planning for. That sunk cost of inventory will never go away. It just is a layer that will always be there. And once you get into rolling production, it just becomes something that's an asset for the business. And the rest becomes the cost of goods sold. But starting that new lineup, starting that new, brand, everything else always comes with that infrastructural cost until you phase that brand out and utilize all that inventory. So just one more thing to think about, and hopefully something that someone on your team managing kind of pulls into their scope of kind of responsibility. And then the real goal is just, who do you have that's internal that you want to grow versus what do you need to bring in from the outside? That's up to you, and it's going to be different for everyone. There's no cookie cutter response. That's probably enough ranting for me. And, I think we could go all day talking about people and human resources, but it's something to really think forward on as opposed to start reacting afterwards. It is very, very difficult to hire, as I think everyone probably listening and everyone on this knows. So getting that right person ahead of time, I couldn't stress more.
Sounds good. Eric, did you want to comment there?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on what John's saying about the human side of systems and, coming up with that growth plan is really important. I'll caveat by saying I don't think this take is probably as relevant now with not seeing double-digit growth for most breweries year over year, but something that I've seen is detrimental is when you're growing quick, throwing different tasks or titles or job duties on people as you grow and not essentially building the systems around a specific individual as opposed to a position, right? Like you should be building your organization and growing into the positions that's needed. And hopefully you have people that have the competencies that you could backfill into that, but not developing special positions or duties on certain individuals just because they're good at it, but nobody else understands how to do it. And next thing you know, it's 6 months, 18 months later, and they move on to a different company. But you have this key linchpin in a lot of your systems built around somebody's institutional knowledge. And while that's helpful to grow quickly, I think everybody would agree, and everybody's kind of getting at the point on, building those systems from the bottom up and knowing where you're going to get so that you can adapt more easily as needed. And that human element is what helps us succeed, but it can also inhibit us because we're all flawed, right? We all have ego and our own goals and our own visions. And you hope that everybody's vision is the same as yours as an owner, or somebody in a C-level position, but that's not always the case. And when you start expanding, it's harder to control over that, especially if it's not on one site. If you have different locations, your culture is as important as those systems, and finding somebody that can replicate that within your mold or the box that you create and your standards is important but very difficult. It's been done really well from a lot of places, and it's been done very poorly. And you want to be able to walk into any extension of your company and have the same feel and touch and experience. And you want that for the employees as much as you do for your guests interacting with your product.
Yeah, good point. I wanted to ask too, if you have people with those core competencies, I'm guessing it's really important to lighten their load on some of the other things in order for them to be able to focus more on the new spaces and places. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. On that, as well as what Eric's saying, I mean, it's no different in having redundancy of pumps that are moving liquid around as it is having redundancy in skill sets. But that, be that as it may, we also want to play to our strengths most of the time. We're always going to backfill, and as a team, we're never going to be perfect and have all of those skills. But we want people who are really good at something to be freed up so that they can focus on doing something that they're very good at, very efficient at, in a much shorter period of time or effort or resource than someone else. That said, I would never want someone to hold the world on their shoulders as like, oh yeah, if you leave tomorrow, like the business is collapsing. That's horrible. It's irresponsible as much as it's irresponsible from a sympathetic management standpoint as it is from a business operations standpoint. You need people to understand that should they get sick, should they decide to ask you to support them in another opportunity, that they have that ability to step away for just a second, because while someone else may not be as quick, as good, as efficient as them at these skills, we try and support each other, because in these businesses, we are teams, and we can't just have one person who knows how to run with the ball. Everyone needs to figure it out how they can support that person should that person not be able to take it and run.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Dustin, you want to take us into production? You're muted.
Yes. I think I kind of come from a little bit different perspective, being from the architectural side of it. I'm kind of looking at what your capacities are and what this new location might require. Understanding what that expansion means potentially to your volume and your demand, increasing that capacity to serve that other location, whether it's maybe you're adding production or you're adding a satellite tap room or something like that. What does that mean for your current facility? And do you have that capacity to ramp up and just produce more with the equipment you have, maybe brewing more often? Or do you need to expand and add more fermenters and more bright tanks? And where do those fit within your components within your existing facility? And how do you add that with as little disruption to your current operation as possible? And then making sure that that's laid out for efficiency. And if you're taking over another facility as an opportunity for consolidating to maybe increase your efficiencies to be better at what you're doing. And what changes might need to happen to your facility, and what might trigger a building permit if you're changing electrical systems or plumbing systems. Those things typically are going to require building permits. If you're modifying a space, it might change the path of travel for egress, for life safety, for handicap accessibility, anything like that, or may change your occupant loads of how many people you can accommodate, what those things might trigger, making sure you're within the limits of the codes. And if you're taking over a different building, expanding into it, does that trigger maybe a change of use permit or a conditional use permit? And looking at other things that you might be doing. Maybe you're adding a food component, understanding what that might do to permits, making sure that you budgeted in there not only just the cost but the time involved to get those systems designed, engineered, permitted, and constructed. And what those things might do, like adding a grease interceptor and adding a hood, what that disruption can mean to an operation that's currently operating, and trying to avoid those hurdles and those surprises as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. John, do you want to add anything about considering a space that will be brewing for itself? You're muted, my friend.
Sure. I think it's not terribly different from the little rant I just had on redundancy of
Right.
our humans and supporting each other. Like, each facility, you don't want to have a carbon copy of one facility versus another unless, you know, you're very, very large and you're talking about efficiencies. We want to play to our strengths. We want to understand, where do we have redundancy to buffer this one? If this one gets too busy, we can support it with this other one. Likewise, but one facility hopefully has different strengths than another, you know, and you want to really lean into that, not just with your facility, but with how you support it with the team. Which facility is going to be really, really the big customer interface facility, where you need to spend more time and more money and more attention on the experience, versus maybe another one has larger facility. It's a little bit lower cost, so you can have more storage there. You know, we should always think, as we're building anything out, as we grow to a larger scale, what are the economies that we gain of that scale? And it's not just about getting bigger is less expensive. It's about expanding in complexity. We should have deeper pools of strength in one versus the other. And so if we can focus on that, that's phenomenal. The flip side there is, all of a sudden you've got a standard consumer base. You know who your consumers are. And unless you're just beating them off the doors with a stick to get in your space, which really isn't typically the scenario anymore, as it was a decade or so ago, you got to understand, is your capacity utilization as a total going to drop? Do you run from having your tanks full 85% of the time to now having twice or three times the capacity and only 50% utilization? And if that's the case, how does that play into your P&L? How does that play into your staffing? Do you all of a sudden now have too many brewers at each location? Can you share, you know, brewers or management staff at multiple locations? I think all these things are great things to think about before you get in there. But it's the same as the human team. It's, you know, have a little bit of redundancy, make sure the two can support each other, but really think about those core competencies and playing to the strengths, so that you really optimize your benefit from having these different locations. I think it's an awesome opportunity, but it can be really scary, especially with that question of capacity utilization. You know, if you triple in size and you go from 80% to 50% utilization, that may cripple your business from a financial standpoint too.
Gotcha. Erik, can you speak to that same? You have new locations, you're purchasing more ingredients, like from your previous chapters. Is there some advantage there, like some cautions?
I mean, yeah, there's economy of scale for a lot of things, but I think the type of growth that we're seeing more recently over the last couple of years is opportunistic and not based as much on vision, where there's a lot of really well-priced facilities out there, or tap rooms, and you see a lot of expansion because it's a good deal. But sorry, this doesn't quite answer the question you were asking, but I think it's important to understand why the previous business went out of business, and also understand that if somebody's on the edge of bankruptcy, they're probably not maintaining their facility very well. And so what you might inherit is more than, well, on paper, sure, if you maybe you get a bigger system, you can cut your costs down and your raw material costs by purchasing more because you're going to be brewing more. But if you don't realize that the deferred maintenance on that is going to cost you another $30,000 to get it back up to speed, it's kind of a wash over however many years you want to kind of expand that out. So I think that the tale is cautionary, but there have been some successes, and I'm not trying to sound too negative about it, but I think the hurdles are often unknown with anything in life, and what looks good on paper as cost savings might not always actualize. I think if somebody has a good first facility and they think they can expand to a second one and it's just going to be magic overnight, that's rarely the case. It's more of the exception than the rule. And in the case of San Diego County, what we've seen over the years is San Diego is very large geographically, and from the populace. And Jeremy and I have worked on having compiling some of this data and having these discussions quite a bit. He's got a really great webcast he did for the San Diego Brewers Guild that's up on his YouTube, I think, discussing some of this. But what breweries haven't really forecast to say they're in North Park, which is pretty central urban San Diego, great craft beer neighborhood, and everybody knows them, and they're a hype brewery and they're doing great. They move up to North County, and it's totally, you might as well be LA at that point, because they might not know who they are, and they have to regain all of that traction. And you've seen it vice versa, from North County breweries coming down into San Diego Central. So I think viewing any expansion or additional opportunity almost as its complete own business unit, and wiping away a lot of the previous traction you've gained, and will it sustain itself if you have to regrow it from scratch? Or are we heavily relying on some of the data we've collected in terms of volumes from our first facility, just being realistic on and how easy or difficult that is to replicate, because more often than not, it doesn't pan out.
Yeah,
but you have exceptions like brands like Karl Strauss that are nationally known, and they have facilities very geographically far from their mothership, but not everybody's Karl Strauss.
Right. So kind of to that point, Carrie, will you take us through how you would consider a financing or a business plan for a new space?
Sure. Yeah. Financial pro forma, a budget forecast. So you usually start sort of two sides to the coin. First step is where are you going to get the money and how are you going to deploy it? So it's in the language of banks and borrowing, they call that a sources and uses schedule. So your sources would be where are the funds coming from? Now, if you're borrowing money from SBA loan, traditional bank, it's just, again, obvious, but maybe overlooked sometimes, is you have to put some equity in. They don't give you 100% of what you want to borrow. So somewhere between, say, 10 and 20%. So if you need 500 grand, they're not going to give you 500 grand. They'll give you 400, 450, depending on all the facts and circumstances. But bottom line is you're going to have to come up with some equity. So that's the sources side of the ledger. And then the uses side is, what are you going to do with that 500 grand? What are you going to do with how are you going to deploy that? So you're investing in new equipment or fitting out a new space or this, that, or the other. But just being mindful, again, for that working capital component that often gets overlooked. So if you borrow all that money and you put it right back into, furniture and fixtures and equipment and this and that, and you didn't leave anything behind for working capital, that could be a bit of a problem down the road. So sources, uses, list them out. They have to equal each other. And that can form the basis for basically your payment schedule. So how much money are you actually going to borrow? What are the rough terms and conditions? So you got, Excel, and you can just go online, these amortization tables. So basically what does the payment look like at certain interest rates in different terms? So if it's a 7-year term and, interest rates fluctuate 6.5%, 7% interest, and what does that look like? And usually you're going to get lending based on the underlying asset for which you're financing against. So, if you're purchasing a building, you're going to get, a much longer payment term. If you're purchasing, trucks or equipment, it's going to be quite a bit shorter. So just encouraging people to kind of model that out. It's pretty straightforward, but the sources and uses schedule will help you kind of establish what are we going to buy, what are the likely financing underwriting that's going to, and ultimately what we're trying to do is what's the cash flow on this thing. So that's one. And then it's you turn your attention to the operating side of the ledger, which is really sales, margins, expenses, and net operating income. What are we looking at? And this is tough, right? I think it's probably the single biggest challenge is, we divide this into knowns and unknowns. And I recommend people start with what you know, because it gets overwhelming fast. But if you think about what you know, it's like, well, who are you how much, what's the staffing look like? How many people? What are we going to pay them? What are the occupancy costs? If you're going to be renting, what the lease is. So start with the stuff that you already know or have a pretty good sense, and that builds a little bit of momentum and, kind of maybe a little bit of confidence to keep you going. And then you work your way up to the sales plan, because that's always the hardest one. Like, I don't know, people are like, oh, what's it going to be? I have no idea. You can do the market data. You can do some of the things that Jeremy was talking about earlier, which is, there's two sides to the revenue forecast, right? It's how many people are going to come in and what do they spend when they do, and what's the frequency with which they're going to return. So you can estimate like how many people are going to come in, and you can use benchmarks for how much they're going to spend, and then you can use models to see, how you're going to flip those tables. But it's an imperfect science at best. So, the sales planning can be the most difficult. And so here I would recommend just kind of doing a best, worst, middle case scenario, because you just don't. But really thinking about being more conservative. Because if you're more aggressive, who are you fooling? And it's like, you want to get the money, I get it, but now you got to pay it back. So you got to make sure that you have a basis for that. So a lot of times you can look at, surrounding businesses if they're relevant, other tap rooms. I'd even look at other restaurants. I encourage people to talk to others in the industry that might be within a vicinity and kind of sniff test, your assumptions. Because if you go in there and think, yeah, I think we're going to get 5,000 people a month in here. They're going to spend, 20 to 25 bucks each. We're going to have revenue of whatever. And then you start asking around and people are like seeing half of those figures, then you got a little bit of a challenge. So while it's imperfect, we call that kind of a bit of a sniff test. Is like, does this smell all right? Let me talk to some people that are actually in business now, and what are they doing? And I've worked with, brewery owners in the past, or prospective owners that have done this. And it can be a real eye-opening experience. It's sort of like real world market data. You can hire people to do this, sure, but I just pick up the phone. There's call a half a dozen. Everybody's more or less willing to share that type of information. So yeah, I'd say, just to recap, start with the sources and uses schedule. Where you're going to get the money, what's the debt service on that, how you're going to deploy that capital. Don't forget working capital. That's cash that you get to keep to cover those shortfalls. And then the operational plan, start big chunks. Big chunks in your expenses are always payroll and occupancy and payroll. Spend your time there. All that other stuff, yeah, you need it, but if you focus your time there, that's sort of your 80-20. You're going to get most of it covered.
Gotcha. John, do you want to pitch in on financial side?
Yeah, I couldn't reiterate any further there, but I think the one thing that everyone should think about is the world that we're going to live in 6 months from now is absolutely not what we planned for today. So it's great to create these pro forma look aheads and all that, but you need to create them for different scenarios, and you need to look internally. What is your plan B? What is your plan C? If something goes towards, your bear scenario and you're not able to, make that break even inflection point, what are your options to delever yourself from some expenses, or increase your top line so that you can make rent, so that you can make payroll? I think it's very foolish these days to think that your plan is going to be what your operations always look like. And so I think it's the only responsible thing to do for your team, your employees, and your business model to have multiple scenarios and multiple levers that you understand how to pull should you need to. And a break-even analysis should be something that everyone is doing on a quarterly basis with the latest estimate, and if possible, a recast of your P&L. Phased growth planning for me is one of the biggest things when you're starting up as a brownfield or a greenfield. Is what can you afford now, and how do you grow in phases to become either larger, more profitable, more efficient, whatever it is. But each one of those growths in each of your phases requires additional resources, whether it's capital or something else. So I think it's really responsible to take a look at what your opportunity is, and then say, hey, can I eat this all at once? Should I eat it all at once? And if not, what is my plan to get from here all the way up these steps of the pyramid what's the requirements and resources, and what's the pace? And should I get to one and the raise is higher than the run, how do I pivot and move to the right so that I can still take care of this business and my team? The other thing I would always urge that I think we keep reiterating on is, man, it's a great community. Ask for help. Get out there and say, like, hey, what snuck up on you and totally screwed you that you weren't thinking about? Like, everyone's willing to share their scars. And, one of those scars that people forget to book enough into the bucket in over and over again, especially in California in alcohol, is insurance. It is going through the roof. Some people won't cover you. You'll be required to be covered. There's all kinds of other crazy stuff. So ask someone who's lived through some pain, and ask someone who's lived through some success, and say, what weren't you thinking about that I could think about? Most likely the craft beer industry is going to tell you, and they're going to laugh about the scars that they've got. Hopefully a little bit, because we're still out on the other side. And then, it's always that lingering question. If you do need a little bit of help, where's that help going to come from? Can you get a line of credit that you don't have to pay for right away? Can you get pre-approved for that? So if there's a bad month, a bad week, one of your tanks implodes because someone forgets to do something as a brewer, which happens, how do you cover that? How do you get through this momentary blip that really ruins your day, your week, your month, but still get to that next month? It's a little bit Debbie Downer here, but call me Debbie.
Thanks, Debbie. Jeremy, you want to take us through a little bit of location consideration?
Yeah, happy to. And Erik touched on some of this a few minutes ago. We did an interesting project focused on San Diego County, looking at some of these different demographics and kind of competitive sets in different parts of the county. But I think it fits really well with anybody looking to expand. I think, like everybody knows, well, I'll say it anyway, you don't want to just jump on, this location because you're getting a great deal. The lease is really cheap, or someone's going out of business and selling it for cheap over here if all of your customers live over here, right? Or if you do make that decision, you want to be thoughtful about it, and you might need a different business model if you're doing something like that. So I think it really comes down to using, and you can use public information out there, whether it's like pulling it from the most recent census or something that your state's doing, but a lot of times they're really good at tracking different demographics and trends by zip code, for example. So you can look at population and density and growth, male to female ratio, income levels, education levels, all sorts of different things, right? And try to find areas in a county or a city where your ideal customer is most likely to be located, and then put your spot right next to them, right? Make it really easy for people to come in, especially if you're a new location, and come and get your beer or whatever you're serving. Then also, especially these days, because we're not just competing with other breweries, right? We're competing with really any hospitality business or entertainment business. So understand the different, breweries in your area, whether that's maybe you're in a walking part of the city. So really look closely at what's within like a half mile or a mile, or if it's a driving area, maybe you're going to look out a little bit further, but understand what that competitive set looks like. Visit them, talk to them, like Carrie was saying, try to identify what they're doing well, or maybe find a gap that's not currently being served in that location. And then use all this information that you just gathered. And then as you're setting up your space, put it to use, right? So maybe you don't want to copy your menu of your current location exactly if there's some different people that you're going to be selling to in the future. Maybe you're going to have different events, or you want to plan them a little bit differently. Even how you build out your space. If you're maybe in a real up and coming young family neighborhood, you want to make sure you have a spot for kids and stuff to hang out. But if you're not in a space like that, you don't want to spend the money or the space on that. So you can really use some of these demographic information based on the geography you're going to be located to make some of these good decisions. So just to kind of recap that, you're making a really important decision, right? And it's not something that you can just like pack up shop and move over 3 blocks 6 months from now. You're pretty locked in for at least a couple of years probably. So make sure you're doing the upfront work to make sure where you're planning your new location is going to be a spot that works for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Eric, did you want to add anything to your earlier discussion about moving locations and having it be too far for people to really understand your brand?
I just think just because you see somebody else from the outside looking successful, it doesn't mean they are, and everybody measures success in different ways. So, that's more of an ethos than a action plan. But, talking about North Park, San Diego, it's filled with a lot of great breweries, but everybody went there because they saw everybody else going there. And, some have done really well there and some have struggled, but understanding who you are and what Jeremy said, who your customers are, and catering to that as opposed to chasing trends. And trends in this business doesn't just mean the new beer style. It means the way that you're growing your business. There was a lot of chasing trends in the way people grew their businesses for the last 10 years. And there's been a lot of struggles because of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. John, you had mentioned cannibalizing your current customer base. Do you want to comment a little further on that or leave it be?
I mean, sure, always up to talk about cannibalism. No, I mean, there's two things. It's Eric, like to your point, if you're too far away from this very, very identifiable brand that resonates so well in a region, if you double down in that region, do you have a big enough, a big enough following where it works well? And we've seen companies do this really well. I mean, look at the Pizza Port model. It's not that far geographically, but man, they do a great job. Great beers, just different enough, and everyone's always having a good time. But there's an opportunity where there's just a little too much, too close, and we've seen this over and over as well. And there's just not enough meat to fill the seats, and you start getting more and more seats. You got to figure it out. So the flip side is also true. But then think about, exactly what you said. If you've got an area where you've got a brand that resonates so perfectly, but it's very specific, and then you move from San Diego to, even Los Angeles, somewhere that's close, people in San Diego and people in Los Angeles don't always see the world in the same way. In fact, typically they don't see the world at all in the same way. So it may not work well at all there, even though everything seemed to be working perfectly. So I think it's really relevant to just know who you are and know where you're going to be. And it'll make everything so much easier as you move down the road. If you can identify with both the region and the brand, or your people, if not you personally can, you'll understand before you get there if it's going to work, I think.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Dustin, will you take us a little farther into evaluating specific places? I know there's a lot of talk lately too about rent and how landlords have really been pivotal to success or failure of businesses. How does that play? And are there other areas you want to dive into a little bit more there?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things to look at when you're looking at, what caused the demise of the previous occupant, and was it related to the craft beer industry in any way? And if it was, then what triggered that demise, and how are you going to work around it? And then what kind of lease terms are you going to have with your landlord? What do they include in that? Is there any maintenance that needs to be done to the property that the landlord's going to take care of, or evaluating the mechanical systems, making sure they're up to speed, and what their lifespan looks like it's going to be, and then understanding what kind of improvements may need to be made to any space. If you're going to be renovating anything, what are you going to change, and what kind of permits and inspections are required for that, and also seeing what things maybe you don't plan on changing, but making sure that those things were permitted originally. We've got a couple of different clients right now that took over spaces that were just a small kitchen, took them over to create a tap room and food component, and found out later that some of the things that were installed were never done with the proper permits. And so now having to go back in retroactively for getting permits for a hood that was installed without a permit is proving to be very problematic. what may have been installed if it wasn't done with a permit. It may not have been done to the codes, which essentially means you're ripping it out and redoing it. And so, understanding those things, and it's in bringing in the right people early on that know what to look for, know how to track down previous permits, and know how to get answers from the building departments, health departments, whoever else might be involved, as to what's there. And if you choose not to address it, understand what that impact might be if and when it's discovered and you do have to address it. Because it's much easier to address it early on before you're open while you're doing other things than to now shut down and try to fix something that wasn't done right to begin with. And that can come into play with like bathrooms that were never handicap accessible, but you're adding a brewery component or a food component to something, you're triggering permits. They're going to come in and want to see a certain percentage of your construction budget dedicated to accessibility improvements. And redoing those bathrooms could be, in one situation, what we're working on currently, there really is no easy way to make this tiny bathroom space big enough to be accessible. And so it's going to cause reconfigurations of other spaces and impacting a large percentage of the property just to make one bathroom accessible. That if we had been able to address those things sooner, that can potentially be negotiated in the lease as well. If you're talking with a landlord and saying, hey, this space has got some problems, not only but for me, but for any other tenant that comes in here, are they willing to either fix them or potentially help contribute to making them compliant with what they need to be?
So is it advisable to either find somebody or do the meeting and introduction of everyone in the municipal side of things where you want to go to vet that?
To an extent, or at least having someone that knows who to go to and what to look for. I mean, for me, what we would start looking for is looking up building permit records to see what permits have been pulled on the property and seeing if it's not going to be perfect, but you can at least identify. If I find a permit for a hood, then I would assume that hood has been permitted, but you can look into that and see if you see something as benign as a water heater. You find a water heater, looks like it was installed 2 years ago. Technically, you're supposed to have a permit for a water heater. You can easily look up to find if there has been a water heater permit pulled in the last 5 years. If not, then they didn't get it, and it might be a good idea to take that into consideration. What other things may have been done without a permit? But the bigger ones are going to be something like installing big equipment, a hood. That's just up top of mind right now because we're dealing with 2 instances of this right now, where they took over kitchens that have hoods, and then health department said, that's great, but we don't have a permit for this hood. So now you need to get a permit for it. And we find out that no, we not only do we not have the hood, we don't have the right exhaust, we don't have the right makeup air. One of them was installed 20 years ago. And while it might've been to code then, they want a permit for considering it new today and whatever the code is today, not with when it was installed, because it was installed without a permit back then. So, kind of can really open up a Pandora's box if you don't try to get ahead of that and do that proper research when you start evaluating spaces, looking at what were the last permits that were pulled, verifying some things. There may be some risk that you are going to have to take, but knowing that, and what we try to avoid is surprises, and kind of knowing, okay, these things weren't done. What can we do to move forward as expeditiously as possible, but understanding the potential risks that are involved, and do we decide to make those improvements now or take that risk and move forward? And unfortunately, in these 2 instances, they chose to move forward, and now we're trying to retroactively fix things, and it's causing more trouble than if we just done it right the first time.
Mm-hmm. I think when I've heard a lot of stories about sprinkler systems that might not have been required, and then all of a sudden were required or weren't included in the budget, and now all of a sudden are included in the budget. And I think that's a big ticket item.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to go with occupancy and use. And so if it's a change of use, if it was a restaurant before, and now all you're doing is adding beer as a beer component, you're making it your tap room, but it's staying a restaurant. It should be under the use of what it originally was. And if when it was permitted, it was allowed as a restaurant with beer and wine without sprinklers because it was over 100 people or over 5,000 square feet or whatever the trigger was, when it was permitted, as long as you're not changing the use, you can maintain that use. It's when you take maybe a brewery and you add a kitchen to it and you turn it into a restaurant, or vice versa, or you take a bookstore and you turn it into a tap room. That's a change of use. You've got to bring it up to the current codes. If it's in a multi-tenant building, you've got to take into consideration everybody within that fire area, not just your space. Maybe it's a bigger building, 10,000 square foot building that has 10,000 square foot tenants. Well, you change one of those retail shops into a tap room, you now consider the fire area of the entire 10,000 square feet. That requires fire sprinklers in any way you look at it. So, and if it doesn't have them, there's no scenario in which it makes sense for that tenant to pay for it, because if it's got to be in the whole building, in the whole fire area. So bringing somebody in, particularly looking at a change of use, anything that might trigger that, and the change of use, the accessibility improvements, the handicap bathrooms, potential handicap parking, any of those things. You want to identify those things before you sign a lease, before you start making your budgets, or at the same time you're making your budgets and you build those things into it. And that's the same thing we look at when we look at a new facility for a new brewery. But a lot of times for these expansions, you're looking at a secondary location for either additional production or additional taproom space, or adding a food component, way to do that with your brand. And so making sure you're going into a space that is adequate for that and doesn't trigger a lot of surprises later with triggering sprinklers, conditional use permits, special use permits, any of those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So John, when you're starting brewing in multiple places, you want to talk a little bit about QA/QC across the board there?
Absolutely. And I know we're running close to the end here, so I'll try and make it quick. First things first, and this is for everyone, but also for Erik, just make sure you have a microscope at every location. Let's remind everyone, if you're making beer.
It's not my job anymore.
It doesn't matter. It's all of our job. I'm going to harp on a microscope. But seriously, it's when you have a different operation, your quality metrics are likely to change. When you're no longer shipping only draft beer that's within a drivable distance of you, you've moved into packaging, you've moved into long-term storage, you've moved in potentially pasteurization. It's the onus is on you as a good brewer or a good business manager to start leaning further and further on quality assurance versus quality control. You need to start thinking about those leading variables. What can you do in this new facility that safeguards your team, your brand, your facility, and your customers to make sure that they can trust that the product that you're putting out now in a larger area and to more people is just as good as it was before? And in fact, at this new facility with these new different operations, do you need to approach your standards of operation differently than you did previously? There are good things to think about. I could rant on it for a long time, but we've only got a minute and a half here, really. So I'm going to leave it at that and just say, think about the fact that if you're creating different types of packages or beers, different operations to create them with different teams, think about how you put in place behind them different procedures, quality controls, and levels of assurance to match.
Perfect. Jeremy, you want to ring us out here with a little bit of post-expansion metrics?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll keep it quick also here. So just want to encourage everybody, don't wait too long to start tracking some of this data, right? It's going to be real. There's going to be a lot going on the first week, fires going on all over the place that you want to focus on. But even if it's really rudimentary at the beginning, start tracking some of these basic metrics and then give your teams stuff that they can action. So for example, maybe they can't in the short term impact how many people are coming in the door, but they can start to impact how much we're actually selling to those people. So try to keep people in there longer, so you're selling more to them. That average dollars per check goes up. Also, this is a time when you're going to be doing a lot of experiments to see what's driving traffic. So make sure you're tracking the impact of those. So you're not just spending money to get a band in there and not actually see if you make more money because that band's in there. So just to keep it quick, don't wait too long. Don't wait 6 months before you put a data system in place. Really start as soon as possible, even if it's kind of caveman style, really rudimentary to start. And then you can always get it more precise and stuff in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all of you. Thanks for coming and joining the crew. Everybody watching, thank you so much now and in the future for taking some time to think through all these analytics and considerations. I think they make a huge difference to how we run our businesses and our success. So thank you, Dustin. Thank you, John. Thank you, Carrie, Eric, Jeremy. Eric, thanks for recommending Jeremy. And wishing you all a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this session, we'd love to see you in real life. We host in-person workshops across the country for craft beer professionals just like you that are held in some of the most exciting beer destinations around. These immersive events are designed to help you grow and connect with others. You'll meet peers from across the country and leave with actionable strategies for success. Connection has never been more important, and you can learn more at cbpconnects.com. Cheers. See you there.